Hello, I'm Doug Noonan. Happy to talk about a new paper I just read, Cultural Workers and the Character of Cities by Juan Lopez. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Denver. And this paper that appeared last year in the Annals of Regional Science won the Best Paper Award for an early career scholar at the Western Regional Science Association. And I can see why it won the awards. It's got a lot to commend it. It talks about contemporary hot topics, things like creative class and inner city competition for talent. It talks about quality of life and the role of the cultural production and creative sector in helping cities attract the high human capital talent it might want, or actually also generally providing quality of life and sustainable quality of life and neighborhood scenes and character of cities. So it brings a lot of big forces together in a very systematic and transparent, albeit mathematical way. Brings it together in an interesting conversation that, while highly formalized, does yield really important and interesting insights. A couple of the big themes that come out of this paper. For one, he's trying to bring together the idea that when you have multiple types of workforce, maybe the high human capital and more traditional workforces, and the high human capital, high education ends up pushing up housing prices while also pushing up demand for really niche, high-end cultural goods and highly variegated types. There's an interesting tension there where the higher rents end up displacing cultural workers perhaps out to peripheral cities. So the end result here isn't a foregone conclusion where the New Yorks just attract all of the talent or something like this. That there's a place in here potentially for all kinds of variety, whether the cities are more concentrated or more integrated or more segregated. And his model is trying to disentangle these competing and interacting forces to see what really drives things. And in his model, he introduces two key concepts that I thought were particularly interesting. One, he was looking at the role, the ability of these cultural workers, our creative types here, to be able to moonlight. So they aren't just working purely in a cultural sector, they can also be working in the more traditional sector. And I thought that was an interesting bit to say that workers have a choice about how they're going to interact in that cultural production market as full-time or part-time. And then we can see what kind of systems would allow for them to be more full-time and versus more part-time coming out of his framework. The other interesting part that he added, the second piece, is this idea of a love of variety, where he modeled into his framework this idea that there's some substitutability between theaters or between restaurants. Maybe they're actually all pretty close equivalents, or maybe a really strong love of variety, that not all ethnic restaurants are created the same and not all theater productions are just redundant. We actually like the variety of all of these. And so when he puts these into the model, that's an important dynamic to both explaining the different kinds of scenes that can emerge, but also the conditions that support those different types of variety and scenes in our cities. And some of the big findings that he comes up with in his framework are very interesting. The first one that I thought was most interesting is also the most mundane, and that so much of the model ends up following from the role of the housing market. And long story short, if it's not affordable and easily available housing, you're going to have a real hard time supporting cultural workers in an equilibrium that's sustainable. These are going to end up being displaced if you end up growing in one sector or the other. So housing policy ends up being inextricably related to both this sort of quality of life and developing the creative class sorts of policies. We can't overlook the role of affordable and growing housing stock. Other big important parts of this paper include the idea of this love of variety and how important that is in different contexts to being able to support cultural workers in a more integrated or in a more segregated sort of artist colony sorts of cities. And so that was an interesting part of this as well. Now, how much do we actually love culture? I think this was one of my favorite parts of it, was that he didn't have much of an answer for it, and it was beyond the scope of what he's trying to do there. But I think it does speak to some need for future research, where we actually understand surprisingly little about the substitutability across different cultural goods in cities, and how much we really do as residents of cities and in different contexts love the variety of the scene we're in, or do we just are content to trade off for some homogeneity, perhaps out in suburbia or something. So these are all big themes that we talk about a lot, whether it's at CCA or in policymaking venues in more local environments, or whether just at cocktail parties. And that's where I really liked this paper, because it brought some nice insight and clarity in the terms of the trade-offs to concepts and big topics that we talk about all the time. It simplifies some really important and complex interactions, and it tries to tackle these policy relevant issues. It's not just idle theory. If you read it and you can get past the math, then you can see there's really important lessons in here for how you would want to go about combining your housing policy approaches to other goals you might have for sustaining or creating a stronger cultural workforce in the city. with that, I highly recommend it. Well done, Professor Lopez.